when you're looking at something in color, you've got to do this brain switch that turns it into values so that you keep those correct, because that's more important than any of the colors. The mixture of black, you could do it actually very quickly with the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, but I want to keep all the pigments the same for this. So I've done it with cad red and cad yellow and ultramarine blue, about as vanilla as you can get.
And that's it?
That's it. That's it. And so that made my quote black, and I made a pretty big pile of it, and then I cut it with a little bit of white and a mid-tone gray. See how the mid-tone blends in with the palette? I hope you all have gray palettes, because that's really helpful. Because then you can always judge. Well, this is mid-tone. If it's lighter, obviously, and if it's darker, while you're mixing, you know that you're writing the same thing. So it's right here in the middle. In fact, I touched the paint to this and then wiped it off, which is really helpful. And then I did a mid-tone between the white and that to get, so 5 values. Okay, the first thing I'll do is determine what and where is my absolute darkest dark and my absolute lightest light. And those are then my parameters. So in this case, and I'm going to keep 2 brushes, one for my lights and one for my darks, so I don't get in too much trouble here. I'm going to start off with my absolute white, which is the thing we'll use the smallest amount. This is my focal point. So I'm going to put that right on there. You can probably barely see it at this point. You can see it a little bit. So nothing will ever get this white anywhere. Even though there are highlights on the other things, I'll key those down a little tiny bit so that I want that to be. So in terms of the darkest darks, when I squint down, it's the crevice shadow that is always super dark, because that's where it gets no light. And it's always important, I think, to put those in, because otherwise your objects will feel like they're levitating. They really ground your objects. And while I'm doing this, you may see me make some changes, because you're always going to be correcting your drawing. I mean, it just is. And I only get that crevice shadow on these 2 pieces from this angle. And there's a bit of a dark shadow line here. The only time you'll see me use solvent is on the darker lines. And already I see something I want to fix. Yeah, this was off. Okay, now after that, I will literally start crawling up the value scale from the dark all the way up to the light, literally one right after another, bit by bit. So what I'll do is squint at this and I'll go, okay, what's the darkest dark after that initial black? Put that down, go up to the next value, and so on until I reach that top. I'm also doing it a little thinner in the darks, but by the time I get to the lights, I'm going to be laying it on like icing if I can, because then that's always where your eye is attracted to. It's always more the focal point, and you sort of want that paint to be a little juicier. And I try and use the biggest brush I possibly can for everything. Okay, so in this case, my next dark would be the shadows on the darker paper. So I'm going to start with this for that. I feel like I'm working in the dark a little bit here. Oh, this comes all the way down here. The second I see something that is not correct, you'll see me jump right in, because everything is relying on each other, and if something's not correct, it'll jump out. Okay. All right, so I'm squinting down. My next darkest dark is the outside of this pear and this shadow in the middle. And I wish like heck that I could be doing this in color, because, well, I will tomorrow. This is a pretty incredible color with all that yellow dumped in it. I'm not even quite sure what it is. That's where I'd use that whole isolator that we've been using. And as you notice, the black cardboard in the back with the light on is not nearly as dark as the light purple in shadow. It's pretty interesting. By the way, when you paint, you want to hold on to the end of your brush. You never want to be up here unless you're trying to get the most tight controlled painting in your life. You want to keep it painterly. That's the way they're shaped the way they are, so that your hand sits there. Okay, so now I'm going to creep up to the midtone, because this is has more reflected light. This pear is jumping into that and giving me some reflected light. And I'll probably go even a little lighter. I'm still working fairly thin at the moment. And yes, I am constantly squinting. I'm entirely in my mid-tone pile. So I'm looking at this dark purple and I'm wondering what value that is. I don't have great light here, so maybe I have to. It's like right there, which is a mid-tone. So even though I've been doing this a long time and should know what I'm doing, your brain is still always a little deceiving, and you do sometimes need to have a comparison to check your colors with. Right now I'm treating these as fairly flat areas of color, much like a block-in, so that I have the whole general thing, and then later I can go on top of it and start tweaking it. Within each area there are lights and darks, just as in color. Every inch is a slightly different color. So, but getting the general picture first is more important. So I'm still keeping this fairly thin so that I can add paint on top of it. And this did have an angle to it. Let's get a big brush out for that. So far, probably 75 or 80% of this has all been mid-tone. This is a little too center. And it drawing comes over anyway, so. I'm now working in the pile of gray that was between midtone and white. And I will have to make another pile between this and the lightest light, or it won't work out. So the whole time I'm doing this almost like inch by inch, piece by piece. And there were areas that I blocked in quickly, but when I get to this, I'm sort of thinking about carving each plane with each value as I get to it. This one needs to be darker. All right, I'm now making a third pile, and I want this sort of halftone here. And here, where there's reflected light. on the plane of the shoulder there. All right, so I tried to keep it in 5 values, but I had trouble. When you get to a transition spot, often all you need to do is just mix those two opposing values or colors together, and you can sort of, instead of mushing it with a brush, which is one way of softening it, you can just mix the color in between and then add it on. All right, so now I'm going from that number 2 value, mixing it with white for a lighter version, and adding that on pretty thickly. This value needs to get a little darker so that this comes forward. So rather than mix on the surface, which never works and always looks like you've mushed, I'd rather do a scrape off, and then I'll just take that and remix it and lay it on. Mixing on the canvas, I suppose. You can soften some lines, but in general, mixing makes mush. And it does get a little darker as it goes off. Now you'll find all your shadows will be quite dark close, but as they trail off, they really soften up and lighten up. All right, we've got one. So I'm just touching this as light as a feather to get rid of some of these sharp edges. And I'll do this one night. So you see how sharp that is. And if I just sort of touch the edge, it'll sort of soften and merge it. And by the time it gets down here, it gets really soft. It makes a big difference. Shame on me, I forgot the one of the lighter values there. And that is definitely not as white as here. By the way, I will reapply that white and you'll be able to see it a lot more. But right now, I want to get this bottom a little done because it's so stark white, it's going to catch your attention, and that's the last place where we want you to have attention. Let me get a lot more white in there. Because this is the spot where there's a lighter, because it's closest to the light, I'm going to make that lighter, just as I made this lighter as comparison to there. Now, if you can't see the highlights, which you can almost see, but not quite, what that means is that the value next to it isn't quite dark enough. So that's really tricky when you're doing a white object or a super pale object. You start with your highlight, which is never white, which I'm using today for this purpose, but it's never white. It's always a little the color of the light plus a little bit of the color of the object that it's in, pretty much. And then if you put that on, to be able to see that brightly, sometimes it will surprise you how much darker the color next to it has to be for that to come out as a highlight. So let me get this a little more noticeable. When you're doing almost anything where you've got light and shadow, even the stems of these pears, I'll put the dark down first. Same with trees and any object you do. I'll put the dark down first, and then I'll catch the lights where they are adjacent to it, leaving the shadow side as much as possible. Whoops, too much. Mid-tone. Let me climb back here and take a look where I'm going. I'm going to get some lights in here where it's a little lighter. So I'm always looking for the change of angle. The light's coming from here, so it's hitting here and it's hitting here. It's not hitting here as much. And so that slight change of value will describe that. Same with down here. That's not hitting the light as much. This is in need of repair. So from here, I could now start tweaking for the next hour, getting it better and better and better. And I won't do that because I want you guys to be able to get to work on this. But the reason I'm taking the steps of, that's too late, value to color is that it's seeing one thing at a time, I think, is going to be very helpful for you, as opposed to doing it all at once. And dealing with these two complementary color still life setups will also, I think, make it a little bit easier to go step by step. You're going to leave this untouched.
Oh, we're going to let it dry?
It's your guide, yes.
Oh, okay.
And tomorrow you're going to do another one. And remember, every time you do another one, your drawing, your composition, your design will improve, because you'll look at it fresh tomorrow morning and you'll go, oh, here's my chance to move this a little bit or move this down or whatever. So that then, just like I took the value scale and touched it to check a color that was here, while you're working, once we really nail the values on your study, then we'll really be careful that the color is the same value. Because that's where the confusion comes. I mean, people would think that I would have painted those pears practically white. And they're, depending on where you are, they've actually got a pretty good amount of value to them. I could have even done them quite dark, a little bit darker, I think. But I was trying to keep to that 5 value, which was actually really with just a dot of yellow, dot of white and black was really, I was doing 3 values. And I had to sneak in another one in between there.
So how many did you sneak in? Just one more? Or
2, between white and, I did 2. Between the mid-tone and number 2, and between white and number 2.
Did you use a medium when you were mixing your values there?
I was using some Gamsol, and actually more than normal a little bit, because the white that I'm using is a little stiff. I rarely even use a medium. Usually I just use paint and a little muscle if need be and try to get it on thick.
So were you using like a 9 and a 5 and a 1 and a 2 and something between the 1 and 2?
You're talking about on the scale?
Yeah.
I started off with the black and white,
Okay.
and then I used the mid-tone in there.
Okay.
And then I did do this one in the middle, but I needed to, then I ended up mixing little variations because there's so much more lights in there, and I couldn't, I could have done it with just the plain and you would have seen whatever was in the light all white, but I wanted a little, why not?
So that scale is interesting because that has a lot more lighter values.
No, it's exactly even. This is black and white from the printer.
Mm-hmm.
If they look right, they're right. And in the end, that's the way you work. Sometimes you have your brain there, but a lot of times you got to leave your brain out the door and just do what is right, what feels right. And remember that after you leave your objects, no one ever is going to compare the two together. So you need to do what's right for your painting. If there's something like really weird in your painting, you're never going to stand next to your painting the rest of your life and explain, well, that was actually there. You got to make it look right. Any other questions? Okay, we're good. Get to work.